After months of gunfire and shelling, feelings of terror, loss, and displacement. Laughter and smiles were seen on the faces of Lebanese people returning home after news of a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah came into effect on Wednesday. They have breathed a collective sigh of relief for now, but skepticism looms over their cautious optimism. The war killed almost 4,000 Lebanese people. About 1.2 million people were displaced from their homes. Many don't know if they'll even find them when they return. Entire villages have been wiped off the map. After Hamas launched its deadly attacks on October 7 last year and was met with an aggressive military response by Israel on Gaza, Lebanon's Hezbollah also engaged in attacks aimed at Israel almost immediately, a day later in fact. The group began launching rockets towards Israel, igniting an exchange of fire across their shared border. At the time, tens of thousands of Israelis were evacuated from their homes in the north, and more than 100,000 Lebanese people were forced to flee their towns in the south. The world warned not to let the war in Gaza spill over into the rest of the region, but it did anyway. Since then, over the past 2 months, Israel began an invasion into Lebanon and a relentless airstrike campaign across the country. Before this, it carried out several unforgettable covert attacks against Hezbollah, most notoriously when it detonated thousands of pagers belonging to members of the group. This may have marked the point of no return for anyone who thought there was room for de-escalation at the time. And the war back then had no clear end in sight. Up till now. The US brokered plan lays out a 60-day truce that is designed to become a permanent ceasefire. A few hours of suspense preceded the announcement of Tuesday evening as Israel intensified its attacks, striking 20 sites in just 2 minutes. The deal was at risk of collapsing, but at the 11th hour, it came through, announced in an ambiguous speech by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Lebanon's Prime Minister Najib Mikati said the deal was, quote, an essential step towards calm and stability. US President Joe Biden said it would lead to a, quote, permanent cessation of hostilities. World leaders expressed relief and sentiments of hope. The question is, though, will this ceasefire actually stick? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we look carefully at the terms of the agreement between Hezbollah and Israel and how they will translate on the ground. We also ask what this means for the war in Gaza, where ceasefire attempts have failed incessantly for the past 14 months, and where Palestinians await eagerly for their moment of much-needed relief. A deal may have been struck, but it remains fragile. Beyond the Headlines producer Ban Barqawi caught up with the National's foreign editor Muhammad Ali Harisi to ask him what the terms of the ceasefire entail and about the efforts needed to ensure its success.
Break down for us the most important terms that were outlined in the ceasefire agreement. What do we know and what do we not yet know?
The main terms of the deal are that first, we will see a 60-day truce during which Hezbollah fighters will withdraw to the northern line of the Litani River. Then the Lebanese army will deploy 5,000 troops to the border. And during the 60 days, this number has to reach 10,000. So it will rise to become 10,000. At the same time, the Israeli troops will withdraw from the villages that they occupied during their invasion. At the beginning, there was an understanding that this withdrawal has to happen during 7 days, the first 7 days of the truce. But apparently, this changed to phased withdrawal, which will take a little bit more time. At the same time, there will be a committee established to oversee the ceasefire or the 60-day truce. This committee will be led by the US and it will have other members, Lebanon, Israel, UNIFIL, and France.
We're talking about a devastating few months that have killed thousands, almost 4,000 in Lebanon. We've seen 1.2 million people, give or take, displaced from their homes. You would think that by now we would be able to reach a more definitive ceasefire. Beyond that phased withdrawal, what's the purpose of the 60-day clause? Is there any other motive behind it?
There is. The Israelis want to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't rearm itself and doesn't redeploy its fighters south of the Litani River. And this is a trial period for this to happen. So they're doing this as a test, and as a test also for the work of the committee that will oversee the implementation of the ceasefire. If they succeed, then it will be turned into a permanent ceasefire. But it has other political motives. It's related to the truce in Gaza, because this is a way for Israel to keep pressure on Hamas to accept some kind of a deal or to free the hostages. Because if the ceasefire is completely done in Lebanon, then maybe they lose one more card that they can trade. So they keep the pressure, and they keep Hezbollah and the Lebanese feeling that they are under threat. And there's another motive, which is the US President Joe Biden went last night and announced by himself the deal, which is a huge step for him. And I think that this was an attempt to claim some kind of a political achievement before he leaves. But the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is more keen on offering this ceasefire to the US-elect President Donald Trump. So it's a 60-day truce that ends after Trump takes office, which means that the real and actual ceasefire will happen after Biden leaves.
In the hours that preceded the ceasefire announcement alone, we saw a mass intensification of Israel's attacks. But also in recent days, we saw the deputy speaker of the Lebanese parliament accuse Israel of ramping up its attacks to pressure Lebanon to make concessions as part of this ceasefire agreement. Do we know if Israel was at all successful in that regard to extract any such concessions at the end?
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that he got US guarantees that Israel will have the right of freedom of action against Hezbollah even after the ceasefire is implemented. But this means that there were no concessions in the actual agreement. If he had a side agreement with the US, it doesn't mean that it exists in the actual agreement that the Lebanese government will sign. One of the main clauses in the agreement that caused many challenges for the mediator, for the US envoy Amos Hochstein, was this clause of self-defense, which Israel insisted that it means that it will give it the pretext to attack Hezbollah anytime it wants anywhere in Lebanon. But the Lebanese firmly rejected. And the solution was that if Israel suspects that an imminent threat is happening, what they would do is they will go to the committee, to the US-led committee, and they will tell them that this is happening. And the committee will speak with the Lebanese army and the UNIFIL and try to solve or eliminate this threat before it becomes a bigger threat. If they succeed in doing it in a certain time frame, then it's done. If they don't, then Israel might have the right to attack this threat. But the way the Israelis are framing it is as if it's a granted right that they can use anytime, but it's not the case.
Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah had reportedly agreed to a truce only days before he was assassinated by Israel. What changed for Israel between then and now? Why was it more inclined now to accept a ceasefire?
There are several reasons. One is the cost of the war. I mean, it's costing millions and millions of dollars on a daily basis. And most of the work that they wanted to do was done in the first few weeks of the war. So they killed the leaders that they wanted to kill. They destroyed the tunnels that they wanted to destroy. So they reached their limit in the bank of targets that they had. This is one. Two, winter is coming, right? And you are deep in south of Lebanon. So it could complicate your operations. It could be really a disaster for the Israeli army. Also on a military level, the maximum they've done is to occupy a few villages and destroy them. So they really didn't create the buffer zone they thought they could have created after killing all the leaders and, destroying most of the communication network for Hezbollah. And now, after 13 months of fighting or 14 months of fighting in Gaza, they are still facing resistance and soldiers are still being killed and heavy clashes are still happening. So I think they wanted to turn the focus again to Gaza because they have big plans. It could be settlements in North Gaza. It could be occupy the whole territory. It could be to try to hit Hamas even stronger, but being distracted in a massive war with Hezbollah and Lebanon wouldn't help. There are two more reasons. One is Iran. When the Iranians attacked Israel twice, especially the second time, they showed the Israelis that they can really hit them. And they fired 250 ballistic missiles, right? What if they fire 5,000, 10,000, 20,000? And I think it made the Israelis worried that this is the bigger threat that we need to focus on now. The last reason is politics. Like we talked at the beginning, Biden is leaving. This is the political achievement. And probably the Gaza ceasefire will mature during Trump's first days.
Israel has managed to kind of force Hezbollah to de-link its cause from Hamas, which is something that up until recently we hadn't heard. You know, we've heard US President Biden indicate that this deal could be a catalyst for a ceasefire in Gaza. Can de-linking these two fronts actually be beneficial for a potential Gaza ceasefire?
It's a very tricky question. First, why Hezbollah de-linked both fronts? Because Hezbollah was dying and wanted to just stay alive, and this is the only way to do it. Hezbollah lost a lot during this war, a lot. It also lost the image of deterrence that it tried to create in people's minds, that this non-state actor can replace an actual army and defend a whole country. This all collapsed. Now, how does it affect a ceasefire in Gaza? I think it's going to do the opposite effect, most probably, because the Israelis, they managed to have some kind of control on this front and put this threat to sleep and go deal with the bigger threat. How can we eradicate Hamas completely? What are we going to do with the future of Gaza? What are we going to do with the Philadelphia corridor with Egypt? Who's going to control the border crossings? What are we going to do with the people who left? Are they allowed to come back? What are we going to do with the hostages? So I think it's going to do maybe for the next few weeks the opposite effect until Trump takes office, and then things might completely change.
Residents displaced from the south of Lebanon have already begun to return home on the same day the truce was announced. But what they will return to find is an entirely different question. Ban also spoke to David Wood, a senior analyst for Lebanon at the Crisis Group. He describes how people reacted to the news of a ceasefire in the country.
The overwhelming reaction from Lebanese has been of relief, which you would expect, and already we've seen thousands of cars returning to the south of Lebanon, being driven by people who've been displaced from their homes, in some cases for weeks, in other cases for months. So there's a sense of relief and also, I think, cautious optimism for a lot of people that the ceasefire can hold. However, it's also worth noting that it's not only been a reaction of relief inside Lebanon. So there are certain opponents of Hezbollah who worry that because Israel seems to be heading towards another negotiated settlement with Hezbollah along the same lines as what ended the 2006 war, that this could potentially lead to Hezbollah maintaining its predominance on Lebanon's domestic scene, even if it poses less of a military threat to Israel.
Being under so much pressure, how much has Hezbollah had to concede for this deal to actually come through? And can we say now, looking at it, that it would be considered a fair deal?
Obviously, the fairness of any deal lies in the eye of the beholder. But I think from Hezbollah, if we're looking at their perspective, The biggest concession that they've made in accepting this ceasefire deal is that they have abandoned the condition, which was that Hezbollah would not stand down and would continue to attack Israel until there was a ceasefire in Gaza. Now, that term has obviously been dropped. However, Hezbollah views the fact that it was able to not be forced into a total surrender and to not only resist Israel's ground invasion in southern Lebanon, but also to continue throughout the very difficult past 2 months for the organization to fire rockets and missiles into Israel was evidence that it hasn't in fact surrendered, and it's just decided to enter a negotiated settlement to allow residents to return to the south of Lebanon and in general for there to not be continued Israeli attacks on the country.
We also saw in the hours after the ceasefire came into effect, the Israeli army warning that civilians would be prohibited from returning to their villages. But this deal was supposed to ensure that residents of Israeli and Lebanese border towns would return to their homes. So given these terms, how likely is this to be the reality on the ground?
So I think that it will depend on a few factors. The first and most obvious one is, where are their homes located? So IDF troops will not be withdrawing today. Clearly, villages that they're present in or they're near, it would seem for now that the displaced won't be able to return to those. Also, another factor to consider is the risk perception of the displaced. So it would seem, for example, that people who've been displaced from northern Israel might be a little more hesitant to return to their communities until they've seen that stability has returned to the area, whereas already we've seen residents of southern Lebanon making the trip straight away down to go and check on their homes and potentially to move back into them. And then, of course, the third, and this factor really applies on the Lebanese side of the border especially, is what's the extent of damage that's been done to people's homes and their communities?
Can you explain to us the role of the Lebanese state in the ceasefire negotiations, given that the war and the truce is between Israel and Hezbollah specifically? So who has been calling the shots here? Is it the state or Hezbollah? How does that dynamic within the ceasefire negotiations actually work?
This is a reason that we need to be, or one of the reasons that we need to be cautious with our optimism about this ceasefire agreement. So the Lebanese government is a party, obviously, to the ceasefire agreement. But operationally speaking, the main requirements that are imposed on Lebanon will be carried out by the Lebanese armed forces, the Lebanese army. And indeed, this was a criticism of the Resolution 1701, which was struck to end the 2006 war, was that the Lebanese army never had sufficient capacity or political will to confront Hezbollah and to ensure that no members of Hezbollah or other armed non-state actors were south of the Litani River, as the resolution required. Now, in this case, so much is going to hinge with this ceasefire agreement on Hezbollah's willingness to cooperate and coordinate with the Lebanese army to withdraw Hezbollah weapons from the prescribed area, so near the Lebanese-Israeli border. In this case, I believe that there's another problem, which is that even if you had full cooperation from Hezbollah, the amount of tasks the Lebanese army is required to complete under this ceasefire agreement is enormous. So it's not just to ensure that Hezbollah pulls out weapons from south of Litani, it's also to eliminate unauthorized weapon storages and weapons production facilities. And on top of that, it's required to monitor all of Lebanon's border crossings. At the same time, the Lebanese army, like all state institutions in Lebanon, is suffering from the impacts of Lebanon's unprecedented economic crisis. So much of whether the agreement succeeds will hinge on its performance, but it desperately needs assistance.
Is Hezbollah now expected to kind of lay down its weapons entirely? I mean, is that even a realistic possibility?
I mean, anything's possible, but I don't think it's very probable at all. And we saw an indication of this yesterday before the ceasefire agreement was reached, when the leader of Hezbollah's parliamentary bloc wrote an article in a local newspaper insisting that the resistance, as Hezbollah styles itself, would be part of the equation of Lebanese politics, even in a post-war scenario. So Hezbollah appears to have drawn a distinction between its weapons and infrastructure south of the Litani and its military infrastructure in general, so north of Litani and the rest of the country. And the party has signaled from the outset that it's not willing to just lay those arms down, even though this is a demand that's been made by Hezbollah's political opponents for many years now, but especially in the past 2 months, having witnessed Hezbollah's surprising weakening. I just don't think it's very likely that Hezbollah would accept those demands, and certainly not in the immediate future.
US President Joe Biden has said that Hezbollah will now never again be able to threaten Israel's security. But how realistic is this?
I think it's an aspirational statement, and that's certainly what Israel and its allies are hoping for. But also, I think there's a lot of skepticism about this inside Israel itself. So some of the most vehement opponents of reaching this ceasefire deal were people who have been displaced from the north of the country. And their argument is that allowing Hezbollah even the chance to regroup and rearm itself would mean that this problem will come up again in future. So there is still opposition. The other side to that argument is this: is it actually possible to destroy, like, completely an organization like Hezbollah, which is deeply rooted in Lebanese society, has weapons and military infrastructure, not just in the south of Lebanon, but in other parts of the country? And perhaps realizing that, Israel's security and political leaders realized that the actual elimination or complete neutering of Hezbollah as a military threat was never a realistic goal in the first place.
David, who won?
This is the trickiest question. If we look at what happened in 2006, I think that Resolution 1701 was brought in, and it reflected that while there had been a stalemate that had been achieved, it was Israel at the time that was really pushing to get out of that conflict. Since then, we know that Israel has gone away and spent 17 to 18 years learning from its mistakes in 2006. And its campaign in Lebanon, especially in the past 2 months, has shown that it had learned a lot of those lessons and carried out a much more precise and targeted strategy. In this sense, I think that as we emerge from this stage of the conflict, it would seem that Hezbollah had more of an incentive for there to be a ceasefire reached than Israel did. On the other hand, Israel has still decided that now is the moment to enter into a ceasefire. So again, I don't think there's necessarily winners and losers, but I do think that Hezbollah has suffered severe blows in the past 2 months, some of which could take it years to recover from. And that's probably going to be reflected not just in this ceasefire agreement, but also in how this ongoing conflict between Israel and Hezbollah plays out.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. Follow our live updates on this and more on thenationalnews.com, where our reporters on the ground in Lebanon and behind the desk here continue to provide news and analysis for you. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and Dua Farid is our editor. And I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.